An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, here we go. Friday, November the 4th. Welcome in. Queen Victoria had a little bit of an obstacle this morning doing her trip around Queen's Park. They have gathered on the lawns, and, this is going to be, for me, Days of Action 2.0. Let's start with that, shall we? This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, joined by our usual suspects. Sabrina and Nanji is here from the Queen's Park Observer. Keith Leslie, a contributor at CHCH-TV, and John Wright from Maru Public Opinion. My memory goes back to the Days of Action under the Harris government. And, John Wright, Premier Harris didn't have the Notwithstanding Clause at his disposal, or I don't think he thought of using it, actually. Imagine if he had. So this is where we are. I do not see a way out of this that's going to be anything but messy, and I don't know that you're going to be able to really salvage the education year.
This is a really tough thing to poll on. It's easy to say, based on what you've seen, read, and heard, what side are you on? But to get into the nuance of a notwithstanding clause, you have to explain it to people. So we are elite. We're talking about it. We know the implications of it. The unions are screaming and yelling about it. But this is kind of over the heads of most people. So this is something you have to tell people about. Interestingly enough, I'm not polling on it, but interestingly enough, neither does anybody else seem to be putting anything into the public domain. But I would suggest, Dave, that if people are just asked where they are on this, the government will have well over 40% of people standing with them, which is a majority for what they need, and therefore they're okay with it. I would say, however, the more philosophical stance, which I think will trouble the elites and others, will be that the use of the notwithstanding clause is really the nuclear warhead of legislation. And this was seen as more of a land war that could have been won in a different way. The unions, by taking the strike vote after the premier had said, don't test me, certainly set it up for the government to respond. And secondly, going into a negotiation where their union is leading the way for all of the other negotiations to follow with 11%, was foolhardy in a way, because within a few days they dropped it down to 6%, which they could have started at to begin with. So anyways, a long narrative to say, I think the government's got the percentage of people that they want with them. And they probably have a lot of parents who are there too. But the philosophical and long-term implications of other provinces using this for these sort of things that I think were never intended to be used for is precedent-setting, no question.
Well, notwithstanding used 5 times in 4 years just between Ontario and Quebec alone.
Mm-hmm.
We know Saskatchewan has been, using it. So the fact, I think you're right in terms of that nuanced argument is one thing. I don't think it's any less serious. But Sabrina, this started on the wrong foot to begin with, in bad strategies on both sides. And then I thought it was a little rich by half when this week the mediators said, you might not want to be negotiating in the media. There should have been a media publication ban right away as soon as we saw the way this was going. Who couldn't have anticipated that? So there's nobody who's on the side of the angels on this one.
Yeah, obviously, CUPE was right out the gate with a pretty generous, for their workers proposal with 11%. But that's kind of how negotiations work. You come in really high, you expect to kind of come down a little bit. And you're right, there was no so-called media blackout in the early days. And then once we had a private mediator kind of say, stop laying this out with reporters, because obviously, especially when it comes to education, like historically in Ontario, the people you need to win over are not necessarily education workers. It's the public, it's parents. And so we've kind of seen, the Ford government spin this as, the lowest paid education workers versus kids, which is not really what's happening here. And I think for CUPE opposition critics to maybe, win over the public argument. To John's point, like, it's obviously very important. This is like an existential moment for unions everywhere across the country. I mean, obviously, using the notwithstanding clause to just impose a contract, what's even the point of having a union? So there is going to be major pushback on this. The Ford government has opened up a Pandora's box, but they really care about, keeping parents happy. And no one wants to see kids out of class, especially after the last 2 years of these rolling closures that sometimes the Ford government, promised to keep schools open. That didn't always happen. But, I think CUPE needs to stop framing this as this is an attack on our charter rights, which it is. This is unprecedented. Who knows what provinces will do next with the notwithstanding clause. I mean, I just can't wait to see what Danielle Smith does with it over in Alberta. But I think to win over parents, it's you have to make it about kids and families and say, the Ford government is using your kids as pawns at the bargaining table here, because you're right, this is going to get a whole lot messier before it gets better. The Ford government is still in negotiations with other teachers' unions. So this is making it really awkward at the bargaining table for them. We've seen other unions, including unions, private sector unions, construction unions that had supported and endorsed Ford during the election, just come right around and say, we don't stand with this and we need to fight this. With one stroke of a pen, the Ford government undid all that hard work that they had done in the months leading up to the election to kind of win over labor support. So I do think this is, a moment of reckoning, and there's a lot of questions as to what happens next now. But I think for now, the Ford government is feeling pretty confident. They're plowing ahead. Just today, moments ago, they announced that they went to the labor board to kind of complain about the strike, which is just starting now. They kind of preempted that again and solidified the fact that they're going to be bringing in these hefty fines to workers and to unions. I think we'll probably see unions, the organizations themselves, fined more than the individual picketers. But this is a big can of worms, and Queen's Park basically descended into chaos this week.
Well, Keith, when we look at the two things, and I want your view on where we want to take this, but just based on what Sabrina was saying, it's a little rich to accuse the unions of being responsible for the kids not being in class today or however long this lasts, and that we're fed up with the kids being disrupted. Let's keep in mind that it was the government who made the decision in the day to close schools. It was the government that made the decision to make sure that we had virtual learning. It was imposed, and we all understand why, but that was not because of education workers. What we went through in the pandemic had nothing to do with any kind of action by the union. First, back to the fines, if it's declared, and it is clearly based on the way this is rolling out, they're calling this an illegal strike. It's based on an illegal law.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, the government clearly knows going into this. The courts have been very, very clear that the Charter of Rights does indeed extend to the right to collective bargaining. Absolutely. We found that out when Dalton McGuinty imposed a contract on teachers. Kathleen Wynne, when she became premier, backed it off. But of course, the unions kept fighting it, and they won, and hundreds of millions of dollars. So the government knows this is clearly not just a bad law, quite frankly, an illegal law. You're overriding a basic human right with the Charter of Rights notwithstanding clause. I think that's simple enough to explain to a lot of people. The government is clearly taking the gamble that parents, especially post-pandemic, whether they were mad at the government for shutting the schools during those 2 years or not, are just fed up with the fact that they want their kids to stay, with having to scramble and make alternative levels of arrangements for care or stay home from work or all those things. Now we're into let's face it, a wildcat strike, according to the government's terminology. This is an illegal strike, but the law itself is illegal. So are you bound to obey it? One thing is really, really clear. Sabrina touched on the fact that, the Ford government's, really major efforts by Labour Minister Monty McNaughton to cozy up to the unions, get some of them on side, the private sector ones anyway. Well, that's backfiring with this. No union can stand for this. Of course, the government is also setting the tone for those negotiations with the 4 other teachers unions. So and the rest of the public, but they're really setting the tone for those major teachers unions. But as I say, one thing is really clear in all this, and I believe it was Cynthia Mulligan who was pushing the education minister on this yesterday at his news conference, is the notwithstanding clause is not keeping kids in class today and maybe not next week. So him saying every tool at his disposal, well, here's one. You could have, okay, we won't invoke this, and you don't invoke the strike mandate, and we'll keep negotiating until we get to, I don't know, maybe binding arbitration. What are we going to do? There's other ways to resolve this, especially when the government just reported a $2.1 billion surplus for the previous year. So,
but we got all kinds of pushback when we started to talk about essential service. But people listening, when this was a month or so ago, we talked about, well, make them an essential service, you move on. But even there, you would have had to have gone to arbitration if you did that. So we were relying on that. John, they're not using, to Keith's point, they're not using the tools in their toolbox. They're bringing in, as you point out, the nuclear warhead to deal with this. So what does that say for just generally collective bargaining, whether it's with this particular union or not, in the next 4 years?
Well, I think it shows that the government sees the unions as being the major enemy of what their mandates are all about, and they will use whatever they can to cut them back. I think what's in passing irony is that the Notwithstanding Clause was actually championed by NDP Premier Alan Blakely, among others. And it was mainly to give legislatures, not judges, the final word in some instances, and to ensure that they were accountable for using that power. Well, two things. Number one is you can't really hold the Ford government in that recipe to be accountable until the next election. So good luck with the next 3.5 years. But the second thing, and I'd be interested, Dave, if you have another program with a constitutional lawyer on, because at some point, I know we say this is an illegal law, but it is not illegal because it is legal within the concept of the Constitution. He can do this. The government can do this, just as the government of Quebec has done this. So yes, it overrides our rights. The question in my mind is there a source of appeal anywhere in this? Are we going to see at some point a reference to the Supreme Court? In the old days, that's what you would do. Rather than fight it all the way, you would have a government who basically says, you know what, we don't want to go there, but if we had to, we would want to define the parameters of this and get a ruling from the Supreme Court that might say, well, you can use it for this, but you can't use it for that. That in itself is a whole can of worms for doing it. But the question, again, for people like me, having, like most of us, watched politics for so many, many years, is this now the norm? The precedent here is incredible. I mean, you normally would not use this to, use it in a labor dispute at all. This would have been thought to have been huge things for the country. I don't know. Once you get comfortable in using this, and this government in particular now has used it 3 times now, but didn't enact it the last one of the times. I mean, it just gets more comfortable, doesn't it? What happens if I'm surprised? The only thing I'd add is I'm surprised that there's not a general strike. I mean, if you really want to put the unions to the test, this is it, where you get CUPE and then you get the labor unions across the province who decide we're going to put our tools down for a week and bring this whole thing to a grinding halt.
Only the public sector can do it. Only the public sector unions can do it. There's 74% of the public sector is in a union. 15% of the private sector workers in Canada are in a union. 15%. A general strike, who's going to notice them not going to work?
Well, I don't know, except that there's the TTC. I mean, you could say,
I know that.
There's construction workers, there's healthcare workers, there's everybody else. I mean, here's the issue for me, Keith. The government can say we're going to use this for this circumstance, but what happens if the Liberals or the NDP get in the next election campaign? I mean, this is the quid pro quo, right? So all of a sudden something comes up and they end up using future governments end up using it. Secondly, what's to say that this isn't used 3 or 4 more times against the unions over the next, 3 years? It's quite possible that it could. What is the demonstration that shows that this is terrible stuff? And it's basically you must grind the economy and everybody to a halt so that the entire public suddenly becomes aware of what's going on and the precedent that it may be setting. They become educated, and then I can ask a full question on a poll saying, now that you know what it's like, which way do you stand on this? So, but I'm just surprised. If this is so monumental for the teachers, it's got to be monumental for every other union. I haven't seen them yet. Maybe that comes next week, but I would think that this is a great threat to all of the unions.
Well, he's not a constitutional lawyer, but he's the next best thing. I read Andrew Coyne this morning in the Globe and Mail, And Andrew talked about disallowance, and it's a tool that the federal government has. It's based in the original Constitution, the BNA Act. And originally that was it was placed in there to make sure that the provinces during Confederation, there was compliance. But essentially it does what you're talking about, John. It allows for the federal government to say, nope, you're not doing that. Now, that's, I don't know how you can get beyond nuclear, but it's there. So, but Sabrina, I don't see a way out here for either Labor or the government that's going to be anything but really messy.
Yeah,
and that's going to affect all of us.
I mean, if we keep talking about the notwithstanding clause supposed to be this, last resort, that's definitely what disallowance is. I think Trudeau, he's spoken out against the use of the notwithstanding clause in this way to override labor rights. But, bringing something in like disallowance, I think would probably blow up the country as we know it. Provinces would definitely push back. That would be, the other nuclear response here. But I don't think that there's no option, right? Obviously, I think CUPE will probably try to fight the fines with this current bill. Over in Quebec, Bill 21, they use the notwithstanding clause for that. But that bill is in the Court of Appeal as we speak. So, there are some options. I think we heard from the Civil Liberties Association that they were going to try to stop this. But of course, will that have any immediate impact? Probably not. We have already seen some other unions, including private sector ones like LAUNA, and then the public sector ones like, OPSU joining CUPE on the picket lines here. But I think this is kind of the beginning of the end for the PCs. This was a huge move. I was actually talking to a conservative staffer who was kind of suggesting to me that, 4 years from now, people will forget about this. We'll be in a better position. We're going to be reelected. They were feeling very confident, and that, parents are kind of supporting this, and that's who they're listening to, focused on. But then I started, and I was actually convinced by that argument. And then I started talking more to, teachers, just regular people. And I think that this is going to have a lasting impact. If you take $1,000 out of someone's pocket, it's not like they're going to forget about it 4 years from now. And, CUPE has 55,000 workers. The teachers, this obviously doesn't bode well for those, hundreds of thousands of workers. They, all of the public sector has been held to a 1% annual increase for the last 3 years via Bill 124, also being challenged in court. And so I think that, when you have all of these union workers, they're not going to forget this move. And we're going to see, unions uniting. We're already starting to see it to push back on this. I think at the end of the day, the Ford government, we have seen them kind of pivot when they're faced with public pressure. And I think that that's kind of the big question here is what happens next, because CUPE has said they're going to be going on strike indefinitely. If negotiations with the other unions, aren't going so smoothly, and this, of course, is not going to help that. There could be teachers on strike potentially, illegal or legal, depending on what the Ford government decides to do to those unions. And so I think we're really going to see pushback here, to coming from the labor movement. Now, don't forget, the labor movement has been effective during campaigns in terms of advertising, in particular against conservative governments. But the Ford government, the last time they used a notwithstanding clause was to basically muzzle them during campaigns. So can they be as effective in getting their message out, leading up to an election? Maybe not as much as they previously could. But I think that this is a really pivotal existential moment for unions across the whole country.
Well, if the unions are ready to walk out illegally, I fully expect that in the next campaign they're going to say, to hell with the law. We're going to advertise as we see fit. We're going to do what we want. If they're going to go, they're going to go. So, but let me just draw this back a little bit, Keith, because if we look at this, and again, none of us is constitutional law experts, but if we look at this whole thing playing out, what's at risk here is the charter, right? And the charter is basically the spine of the 1982 Constitution. Are we into a constitutional crisis here, or on the verge of one?
Oh God, let's hope not. This certainly could put
us there. I ask
there.
with all seriousness. No,
and
seriously.
I agree. I hope not. I truly do mean that. I've watched this country wrestle with constitutional issues before. I've covered constitutional conferences. The search for common ground beyond what's already there is very, very hard to find. So the Charter of Rights, and the courts have interpreted as such, has become a fundamental core, as you say, the spine of Canadian law. It's where our rights are enshrined and protected. And the Notwithstanding Clause was not meant, as we've discussed here, just not meant to be used in a labor dispute. It just seems, John called it the nuclear option. And in fact, one of the editorial cartoons this morning, I think it was McKay, but I'm not sure which one, had Premier Ford doing the Slim Pickens riding on the nuclear bomb as it dropped on top of a deer and a butterfly, I believe, I guess those were the CUPE representatives and the kids. So, this is absolutely the perception of it all. It seems abusive to use this, and I guess that's the message the Prime Minister is trying to get across, and the constitutional experts, that when the government does this, it is abusive. And when people see a basic human right to collective bargaining, I mean, that's really broadly accepted in Canada. And even though the number of, I mentioned the number of private sector workers represented by unions is only 15%, they are core to the economy. And withdrawing them, I don't mean to say a general strike by those workers wouldn't have a severe impact. It wouldn't get the government's attention. It absolutely would. But they have to take their stand on this. All the unions have to be united on this. And that's why I'm surprised that the teachers' unions didn't, just immediately walk away from the bargaining table. I think one did, if I'm not mistaken. But then again, just wait until today, when the CUPE workers were going to walk out, and see if the teachers were going to cross those picket lines. I know the picket lines aren't being set up at the schools today. They're being set up at the legislature. There's quite a crowd there now, and at some constituency offices for the PC MPPs. But would that have been something to see? Would the teachers cross the picket lines, knowing the government, declared to use this notwithstanding clause? How far are the other unions going to react, and how quickly will they react? Because now's the time. It's got to be, next Monday is pivot. Are CUPE workers going to be in class on Monday? Are they going to consider themselves still on a wildcat strike? Can the government go to the courts and try and get, enforcement of their law that with the notwithstanding clause? I don't know, but I'm really, really curious as to why the teachers have seemingly been so relatively quiet the last couple of days. I'm very, very curious about that. These are not quiet people normally. And one thing, just in an aside, and I mean it almost facetiously, but boy, if there was ever a way for the Premier to get out from under all that publicity about refusing to testify at the Emergency Act inquiry in Ottawa and the court challenge on that, well, this got us talking about something else, didn't it? But it's just because it's so bloody outrageous.
Squirrel. John, are we into a constitutional crisis here, or are we overplaying it, overthinking it because we've normalized this behavior? But, just to frame it, it's worth noting that none of the times when it's been used in Ontario, and I don't think in Quebec, has there been a place where the courts have actually said your law is unconstitutional or your law is illegal, then you use the notwithstanding clause. That hasn't happened here. It hasn't even gone to the courts.
No, and that was going to be my point. Again, in a sense, we are in what Sabrina said. We're in an existential constitutional crisis. That's what it is, because the legislatures have been given the right to do what they're doing. Therefore, in a sense, it's not illegal, right? Like, you have to kind of go into that box. What has surprised me about all of this, again, is just the lack of coalition building that the union has done on it. There are a lot of people that could be affected by this. There are a lot of future decisions that could be set aside because of this. To ramp it up where you've not only got unions beside you, but civil liberties associations, like a whole group of people that's much more, a broader coalition. It does exist out there. But when I saw the leaders of this union in the legislature yesterday screaming and yelling at the empty chair of the Premier, that doesn't do anything. I mean, honestly, we all of us who have been in the media and who look at polling know that perception is everything. And when you see that kind of vitriol coming, it doesn't help you. What does help you is to constantly say, look, we're trying to be fair and reasonable, and that this is an outrageous circumstance, and we are being joined by the following people. I mean, you've got everybody from fire unions to everybody else. You've got everybody else that you could be building a huge coalition towards. it just doesn't seem to have happened. It doesn't seem to have been put together.
Well, because
and it
I
ends up
don't
in
think
just
people
screaming and yelling.
anticipated.
Well,
I don't think people anticipated it going this far in this respect. I mean, I think there were other options out there that would have been more reasonable, would have been more mature, would have been more acceptable. You know, back to work legislation is not a new thing in this province. I mean, we've seen them use it over and over again. Essential worker legislation is not new. So there are other steps that they could have taken, I think, in that respect. But it really does speak to more or less the tone of general dialogue around all of this, Sabrina. I mean, Keith talked about, living through having to report on the constitutional crises in the 70s and the 80s in this country. The difference is that the first ministers had enough respect for each other to sit down and talk about what it is they needed, what it was they understood was appropriate, and make accommodation and have not always a friendly conversation, but it was at least a spirited and respectful one. We have thrown all of that out here. There is no basis for that in the context of this, I'll call it dialogue.
Why not a reference to the court?
I,
Sorry, Sabrina. I was just curious. Why not a reference to the court before the notwithstanding clause?
Yeah, no, I was gonna just say, like, I thought Laura Walton, like the head of CUPE's like local bargaining unit, that's kind of been the face of the union side of this. Like, I actually think she's very effective. Like, I've covered union leaders in the past during some of these labor disputes, and Walton, like, she's very passionate, and she kind of has this good mix of telling her own personal story. Like, she spoke for herself as a parent. Her kids aren't going to be in school today because of the strike. Her son is missing out on a football game and he's really upset about it. But she said he told her, Mom, if you don't fight for this now, who will? And, who's next? And so, of course, I think she is effective that way. Obviously, these are very passionate people. We had all teacher union heads shouting shame at PCMPPs as they voted in favor of this bill. But I think the reason why the other teachers unions are being quiet is because they're still in negotiations right now. So they're trying to play it cool. But obviously, if things break down on that side, I don't think there's going to be any hesitation to kind of, join the ranks of CUPE, and they'll be fighting this as well.
They've already
and
hesitated.
Even from the minister's side. Yeah, exactly. And even from the minister's side, he may have like a bit more of a calm demeanor when he's giving us his talking points and his spin, but he's just kind of pitted workers against students. And I think that framing of it is really, detrimental to the union too. And so obviously the mediator was just kind of, asking both sides not to reveal so many details about what's happening behind the scenes. But I think, where this goes, that the outrage, I think Fred Hahn, even the CUPE head, he was kind of yelling back at reporters too in his scrum. And so this is something that's going to rile people up. But, the public perception of that, it's only a matter of time until I think we start to see parents, come banging on the doors of Queen's Park if this thing continues.
Well, I can understand why the teachers' unions aren't stepping up right away, to Sabrina's point, to some degree, and as much as the negotiations are going on. If they were to have jumped into this fray right now, they would have taken all the heat and all the attention away from the CUPE workers, I think.
When the government shows you who they are, believe them. I'm paraphrasing Maya Angelou there. It's clear what they're going to do. Why would the teachers stay in negotiations? They just saw what they're doing with the lowest paid workers. Walk now if it's that important a situation, and we seem to believe it is as just political observers. If the union movement, if this is that existential crisis, what is the hesitation?
But let's also step outside of this immediate circumstance in Ontario. Every month I do probably the most extensive poll on the economy and people's personal financial situation. Like I've got 20 odd pieces that I measure in an index. And let's read the room for a moment. For the very first time in my tracking, we now have a majority who are struggling to make ends meet with their own finances. I mean, the highest group, or the group who's feeling it the most, are the 18 to 34-year-old group, who believe that their own personal finances are in peril, who are worried about their finances every day. We have, ready for this, we have 70% of the people who believe that the economy is on the wrong track. It's 77% within that particular age group of 18 to 34. Well, who are they? Those are the people with kids in schools. Those are the people who have got variable mortgages. I was into the bank yesterday. Thank God, we put our finances in the right place. But I said, "What are you seeing?" And they said, "We're having people coming through our doors all the time who, in fact, because of inflation and the rise in the interest rates, it's that 18 to 30. That's that 30-odd-year-old group who've now maxed out on their credit cards." And they're going, "What can we do?" And it's kind of like, well, you can't do much except sell your house for a loss and move on. I mean, read the room for a moment. You walk into a government and say, "I want 11%. Okay, I'll settle for 6." I mean, the rest of the people in the country, there's no chance they would ever do that. They'd never get that. So I think there's also this other piece that says, "I know you're low paid and I wish I could help you out." On the other hand, I'm struggling with my own finances. We've got inflation that's rampant. I'm not going to get a raise. So why should I be with you? I think that's another dimension you got to kind of overlay with all of this. It's not to say that it gives the government an extra line to kind of put out there, but it certainly would be, most people would be quite perceptive and receptive of somebody who would stand up and say, "You're not going to get a raise. So why should these people get 6 to 11%? It won't hold water against what's happening in the economy.
I can go back to the days when I was working in radio. It wasn't unionized, and we certainly weren't getting, barely inflation year after year. But I think you're right from that perspective, and that's why I say I think that both sides, or all sides in this, blew it on their first step out. I mean, we raised the question around, was it a good idea to throw that number out, $39,000? To some degree, yes, in as much as it probably rang true with the demographic you've identified, John, and saying, hey, that's me. I live with that. I can't live with that. I understand why somebody's going to be asking for that. But then to qualify that as, an 11% increase when it was $3 an hour. So they played, kind of loose with the numbers on both sides, where Lecce telling, the reporters that this amounts to a 50% increase. Well, shut up. It doesn't, in terms of what their demands were vis-a-vis wages. So there's again, I go back to the whole notion of nobody's on the side of the angels here. And I think what you describe is a level of frustration, decision fatigue, whatever we want to call it, coming out of pandemic, that is going to make this an extraordinary circumstance, and all the more difficult to resolve in any meaningful way, that really is going to put us back on some kind of footing that we feel stable in. What is the end point? What's the end game, I guess, is really the question. Let's just finish on that, Sabrina.
I mean, I think for me, I'm kind of concerned about the longer term implications of this. Not aside from, more broad, use of the notwithstanding clause, more frequent use of that. I think also, what's going to happen to the education sector? I mean, not everyone is getting 11% wage increases, of course, anywhere. But, these workers have been held under wage restraint for years now. And so they have a lot of catching up to do. And if I'm, an employee who can't make ends meet, I'm going to start looking towards the private sector. I'm going to start looking for other jobs. I might start looking south of the border to the States. And I think that's kind of already been happening to some effect in our healthcare system. And we've seen, what staffing shortages for a lot of factors, not just wages, but we've seen, what that's done to our healthcare system. What does this mean for the education system if we're not paying people, a decent wage there? Are they going to start leaving? And who's going to be left? What is going to be the state of our public education system, which is, of course, the bedrock of our country. So, I think looking down to the long term of this, I'm not sure how this is all going to play out, but I think that what's happening right now is going to have some, long term effects on the system.
I mean, I think you are right. When you look at the demographic circumstance in this country and how few people are, being born and moving into, and how few immigrants we get into this country, this month alone, the federal Statistics Canada is reporting that we created 108,000 new jobs. I mean, people are taking other jobs. People are moving from where they were, and I think we're seeing that in the healthcare system. I think you're right. What would happen if many of these people turned away and went somewhere else? They've got options now that they may not have had before.
Final thought, Keith?
Well, I think the government's picked a fight here that it's going to get bloody on both sides, and parents and kids are indeed caught in the middle here. And I don't know the resolution of this. How long can CUPE afford to stay out? Do they really plan to stay out on a wildcat strike next week, or is this going to be a one-day protest and back to the work next week under protest or work to rule or whatever they want to do? But can they afford to stay out? Will they stay? Will other unions join in? I mean, it's really interesting at this point. I mean, I think CUPE's position should be set up picket lines at the school, see if the teachers cross them. That would be my next step in this situation. It is force someone to get on my side. But I don't know if that's the way they want to go about this. I'm not advising them on this. I don't know how the best reaction to what the government has done. But I think they need more support, and they need it right now.
All right. Well, that's very rare that we spend the 35 minutes or so just talking about one subject, but there's clearly more to be said. We'll watch the developments unfold. Just a programming note, next week in our Now and Next feed, we are going to feature a 4-part mini-series. It's a limited podcast series that tells some really cool stories about the RCAF and aviation history. And I was a little surprised. I'd like to think I'm paying attention, but surprised to realize that Toronto is actually at the center of a lot of the RCAF history. So join us for Now and Next, and we're going to feature a series called Pathway to the Stars with the RCAF Foundation. That's Monday on Now and Next. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend. And, well, and such as it is, for some of you, the weekend has already started with the kids out of school, etc. But we'll be back in your inbox first thing next Friday, and we'll just see what kind of a difference a week makes here on The Ledge from Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.